part of a project documenting the early years of the Experimental Psychology Society, I'm here with Bob Audley. Bob, thanks again for your time. You may have heard part 1 of our conversation. Well, this is part 2, where Bob recalls news stories that we didn't hear in part 1. Now, Bob, I understand that you'd like to say a little more about the founding members of the EPS.
It's interesting that I think a lot of it is covered by a seminar that the Wellcome Trust organised about the Applied Psychology Unit and its succession. And that was chaired by Richard Gregory. And Richard Gregory seemed to be a kind of link between those founder members who often were at the APU and the Experimental Psychology Group and later Society. Amongst the people there, of course, was Hick, whom we've already mentioned before. And, of course, Hick and information theory was quite influential in the early days of the Society. And a number of people developed areas in that, including later Richard Crossman, who was in the Society for a while and then went off to America. And the other person who, I don't know that he was at the APU or not, is Welford, and who had developed the single channel approach to the psychological theory. But although I only remember that he had a paper in the British Journal of Psychology about 1952, so I don't know how early that single channel idea came into operation. It may have reflected thoughts of Craik. I don't know. It's possible. So I think it's important to recognize their influence in several ways, because information theory and single channel theory was still very evident when I joined the Society. There's one other person there which we haven't mentioned, and that was John Whitfield. Now, he came to UC as a reader when Roger Russell joined, as I mentioned earlier. He had done some work on problem solving, and he had a paper in the Quarterly Journal. And I think it was actually, though it doesn't get mentioned a lot, I think it was actually quite influential and led to a theme of work arriving at Peter Wason and his work on confirmatory bias and so on. So I'd like him to be more remembered. He seemed to have vanished from trace in records of the Society and so on. Of course, I think he shared with other members of that period a taste for a good drink, and that may have had some influence. Not quite as extreme as Grindley, I think, but the drink did flow quite a lot in those days. So that's what I wanted to say about the founder members. Not very much, but I hope it adds a little bit of, throws a little light onto the background of the group and the Society. The other people I'd like to just mention slightly, by the way, I'm missing out somebody again, which was Carolus Oldfield, who was really quite influential in a way, starting off the psycholinguistic themes which were gradually to emerge in British psychology and the EPS. There was one person who never gets a mention anywhere, and I don't know if he was ever in the Society, and that was George Humphrey, who of course was head of the Oxford thing, and I suppose the predecessor to Oliver Zangwill's. Well, he may have been with Oliver Zangwill. I'm not sure at Oxford. But he was quite a remarkable man, and I was very impressed by his approach to learning, in which he set out his own approach, sort of indicating that it was important to emphasize the sort of non-stationary nature of learning, in the sense that the whole organism was changing. So he was treating learning as a kind of general adaptation of the organism. And I thought that was a good sort of counter to some of the more rigid models that were popular in America, like Hull and so on. So I don't know if he was in the EPS or not, but I think he ought to have been dropped into the scene there. And one other person then, of course, was Maggie Vernon, Margaret Vernon, who was a very strong presence at EPS meetings, and was not averse to making firm statements to speakers about not making their ideas particularly clear. And the one example of that I most remember was when Donald Mackay, who was a physicist at Kiel, I think, who was presenting some observations he had made on the influence of the perception of a random field, like the snow on an old television set, of having certain figures present. And he was showing how these organized the field in particular ways, producing their own sort of field shapes, like magnetic fields in physics. But I should say she's Dorothy Vernon, I think. I don't know why I said Maggie Vernon. And she said, but she couldn't see any of these effects, and she denied they existed, which led to a very enjoyable exchange between all members of the society at that meeting. But she was a very sound perceptual worker and really, I think, quite influential at meetings. So if I move away from them to the people who were mainly making significant contributions when I joined the society, there were particularly Tony Deutsch and Stuart Sutherland, who were, in a way, challenging the kinds of theories of learning that were around at that time. I think that was probably affected quite a lot of the future aspect of animal research that was going on. I remember Stuart having a paper pointing out that if you watched rats in a simple maze, after their first turning, they always alternated and went the other way, which indicated a difference between behavior and what was actually learning, and that these, in a way, although these may help learning, they were not about learning per se. And that certainly had quite an influence on myself, because I've been doing these things on probability models of learning. And I think I became aware that having a model for the actual behavior of an animal probably was missing out the essence of the learning process. And it indicated that in studying learning, one had to be rather careful, I think, about relating data about sequences of responses to any theoretical ideas one might have. I think that stopped me really going on much with any learning models, and I switched choice because I saw that my treatment of learning in the paper I gave at the EPS, which tried to relate time of making a choice to actually the probability of making that choice, it probably overlooked the fact that my model would make animals go faster on the occasions when they would go slower, for example, as they got close to a 50-50 situation. And that led me to recognize that I ought to have inhibition in the system somewhere, and that made me think about inhibition and choice, and led to the kinds of models I was putting forward in the middle of the 60s, I think. So, and of course, and the same was true of Deutsch, who was putting forward ideas which did lead, I think, towards the kind of approaches that later on Macintosh was, and in America, Rescorla were presenting. And of course, Stuart also gradually, in a way, drifted away from experimental work, and when he went to Sussex, was quite instrumental in developing the AI approaches, and I suppose it's the kind of birth of cognitive psychology in some sense, and he and Longit Higgins and others did communicate these to the society it went by. So I remember those as important. But in the memory field, John Brown was quite influential in dealing with alternative ways of looking at short-term and long-term memory. And I think specialists remember him, but I'm not quite so sure that he's implanted in the general history of the subject as I think he ought to be. So those were some of the things I want to say about those. Earlier on, Jake, right at the end of my first session, you asked me what advice I would give to a psychologist. I presume starting as a graduate level or something like that. Whereas I found myself, on listening to the early recording, self-absorbed and tending more to give a talk which would be more appropriate to a careers discussion at a school, or perhaps trying to persuade some government official to put more money into psychology on the grounds of its general usefulness. I didn't, in fact, answer the question about what advice I would give a student, and I'd like to attempt to do that. I think I might be a bit self-absorbed at this point, but perhaps I'm meant to be here. I think the first thing I would want to say is that in choosing the situation and the stimuli and responses that you use in an experiment, you need to be very careful that they are really representative and appropriate for the topic you wish to investigate. I mean, I have in mind that psychologists get caught up with particular categories of material, like, for example, alphanumeric symbols. Now, are alphanumeric symbols really a good set of stimuli to use? Sometimes they're perfectly adequate, but one has to consider whether your result, if you use those, would apply to other kinds of stimuli, and that's, I think, very important. And the other thing is that stimuli tend to have artifacts associated with them, that you may think you're studying one aspect of stimuli, forgetting that there are others around which might be equally significant for your results. So I'd say that about stimuli and responses, because psychologists are quite often rather arbitrary about both their stimuli and responses that they use. Now, the other issue that I would say is, in my work on choice reactions, I had a kind of grand intention of seeing choice reactions as very commonly used in all kinds of psychological investigations, and people didn't really pay much attention to the nature of the characteristics of choosing, which might impose their characteristics on one's data. So, I mean, I had the thought that when I had models which link together probability and response times, I was trying to find a mechanism whereby you could look more clearly from the data through to the theory you have behind. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. Maybe it is nonsensical to think that there is a choice mechanism which comes at the end of rather more complicated events. But it's a possibility, and I still think that there are some features of experiments, experimental results, which owe more to the fact that you're using some kind of choice situation than to the actual topic, memory, or whatever that you might be interested in. Indeed, I have one result in an early experiment which I think always needs to be looked at carefully, and that is related to that the tendency when making a response to have faster responses when the choice requested sort of lies closer to the magnitude of the stimuli being investigated. That's a rather clumsy way of saying that. To take a particular example, you will be quicker at saying which is the brighter of two bright stimuli, and being quicker at choosing a darker of two stimuli. Got to be careful which adjectives you should use there. I haven't bothered there. And I liked it because it seemed to be predicted by one of the models I presented, and I thought it would have some wide generality. And of course it interacts, I suppose, with some of the well-known effects of compatibility of responses with the stimulus values that are being studied. And I remember, for example, a nice example was Rescorla, I think, who did an experiment asking people just to decide which was the larger of, say, a larger of two animals. And of course, you were quicker if it happened to be a rhinoceros and elephant than if you said mouse and rabbit. So, but of course, you've got discriminability issues there. But even if it's controlled out, this kind of result turns up lots of times. So, I still think that this is an important general principle, and at the moment, I'm inclined to think of it in terms of the fact that the speed of response, in a sense, depends on the distance from the extreme anchors, if you could call that, at the ends of the stimulus range used in the experiment. So that's something that hangs around. And by the way, that leads me to quite an important but seemingly trivial matter, which is when you find out, when you think you've discovered some possible general principle, finding a decent name for it. Now, when I did all this stuff on when I experiment, I referred to it as the crossover effect, which is absurd because crossover effects occur all around the statistical and psychological world. And later on, those beastly linguists, psycholinguists, came to refer to it as semantic congruity, which is all right, except that I don't think it was really a semantic. It was semantic in some ways, but I was more concerned with the actual mechanisms of making the choice, whereas they were more concerned with one translating a choice of that kind into verbal terms before the choice is made. Maybe they're right, but I think not. And I've never seen any evidence against my situation except badly designed experiments by Clark and colleagues. So I shall die without having settled that question. The other thing is, psychologists, for the most part, do rely on a number of using, in order to obtain statistical results which to convince one's colleagues, have to use a sample of students. Of course, one has all the problems about individual differences and so on, but it wasn't quite so much that has bothered me, is the fact that in the case of learning, If you get a learning curve from a group of, based on the average of a group of students, a group of subjects, the shape of that curve may be different from that of all the individuals. I mean, the most extreme case is obviously if you have a concept of all or none learning, and all that happens is that different subjects have their all or none moment at different points in the sequence of the trials. But when you look at the curve, you get a kind of rather nice ogive. And so in that case, using the functional form of the group may be misleading about the underlying functional form. And that is another reason why I think wherever possible, one has to look at if you're doing a functional analysis of some kind, you really need to look rather carefully at your results and to make sure that you're actually misrepresenting the true reality of some process. Because I still feel that it is desirable, if possible, to carry out experiments which would enable you to use individual subjects to demonstrate some theoretically relevant point. Of course, it's turned up in from time to time in various ways. I mean, with Shallis and Warrington, and double dissociation of two kinds of storage, memory storage, and so it happens there. But I would like to see more work along those lines, somehow or other, whether it's really possible or not. I do remember with Henry James, whom I mentioned being very influential to me in my final year as an undergraduate at UC, when we did work out little designs where you could get sort of proactive, retroactive, and various other learning phenomena with a single subject. But we never did the experiment, so who knows what. The only time I've ever felt really impressed by individual work is I did take over a postgraduate student who was doing studies of arithmetic in some ways, but we just carried out studies of arithmetic doing addition and subtraction. And of course, if you carry out, using just single digit numbers, if you ask a child in fairly early stage of learning arithmetic to carry out adding two items like that, whether you present the items and ask them to give the sum or the difference, or even if you present the two numbers with a presumed sum, and you just have to say, is that right or wrong? In either case, you do get very clear results that the time taken is compatible with a model which says you identify the maximum and then count on the minimum. You will find that it gives a high percentage of probability in favor of the model I've just described, both on the individuals as well as the group. And this is a very satisfying thing, especially since the teachers thought they were using some entirely different method. So it was quite important that. Again, I just feel that it continues to be important to try and find new ways of looking at individual data. Finally, a lot of experiments use response times of some kind or another in their course. And there always seems to be a kind of messy response measure to use, because although you get jolly good results out of it, I think it's very impressive that you can get replicable results with reaction times. Nevertheless, it would be nice to have something which enabled you to measure time in some other way. I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, in the Pullman phenomenon, where by observing a pendulum swinging and having a filter over one eye, you get to see a elliptic locus. And the reason is that there is a delay in the response of one eye. And if you do the geometry, you can in fact work out what the difference between the responses are at a few milliseconds on the basis of something which is very easy and you can measure at leisure, which is the deviation of the locus from the actual projection of the pendulum. Of course, again, very good in pointing out how careful you have to be about interpreting this. I mean, you might tend to think that it's because the eye responds more slowly with the filtered eye because of the intensity of the stimulation. But in fact, it turns out more careful experiments show it's due to the state of adaptation of the eye. And I think that's a marvellous case of getting a wonderful result and still misinterpreting it. And I think it brings me to the final point on that, is that a lot of psychological progress depends on the elimination of artifacts. And one must always spend a great deal of time in any study paying attention to possible artifacts in one's work, and they can come at you in so many different ways. And in the heat of doing a study, you may well overlook those. In fact, whole groups of people may overlook them because they bear down on a particular phenomenon in a particular way. So that's, I think, important. Leaving aside my thoughts on advice, just coming back to one other matter about continuing themes in EPS, and the single channel hypothesis of Whitfield continues to crop up in various forms, and I was fascinated because one of the techniques that was used and occupied many people at the time when I was first a member was the psychological refractory period. That if you had to rate responses to two stimuli in succession, that there was a delay induced in the response to the second stimulus if the interval between the two stimuli was below some threshold value. And it took so many different forms, of course, and the debate went on, and still bursts up from time to time now. And I was intrigued to see in a recent article in the EPS where, in fact, the refractory period was used itself as a measure of channel sharing. I mean, it was assumed there was a channel, and it was assumed that the two processes in question were in competition, or the experimenter wanted to find out whether they were in competition, and the psychological refractory period was used as a measurement tool for that. But how far the psychological refractory period truly has been demonstrated to be due to single channel hypothesis, I don't know. So I think that kind of controversy may go on forever.
Thank you very much for that, Bob. I do have one final question for you. Now, I hear that you were a boxer in the army. Is that true? Can you set the record straight for us?
My military service was in the Royal Engineers, and I went to the most weirdest organisation of the engineers in my training period, which took place in one of the coldest winters. It was 1947, I think, which was very cold. We were near Newark. And, I mean, for example, in this particular unit, you took one of the first things you did was took your tin helmet, which had sandblasted and so on, and you just emery papered or did whatever you could to make it smooth, and then you blacked it and you polished it, and you clean the brass screw at the top, and you had this wonderful tin helmet, which would not be of great use after the Battle of Waterloo, I suppose. And also, if you went on parade with your your bayonet, you had to clean that, and of course it had been treated to be rust-proof, as it were. But by cleaning it off, you made it likely to get rusty. And of course, you were on parade, and then you were told to fix bayonets and then unfix them and return them to the scabbard. And of course, it got very rusty. In fact, one of the great things I learned in army was just how to defeat rules and so on. So, for example, you can imagine going out and building bridges in the mud, and your uniform and your equipment got absolutely filthy. But then you'd have really tough early morning parades, and you had to have clean equipment, and you were in trouble if you had dirty equipment. So we all bought at Millet's, the second-hand army store, a second set of army equipment, and we kept those hidden away. And come inspection time, we would bring these out on show, while we could go on with our muddy ones. Oh, and by the way, we also bought navvies boots with steel caps, which were not supplied to us by the army, because if you were dropping a piece of Bailey Bridge on your toe, it wouldn't be a good thing. But in these, you were protected. So all very weird. So, but the thing is, it was very difficult not to get to default in one way or another. And then you'd have early morning parades, and that that was terrible, really. Now, if you were in the boxing team, you got up late. Also, you had a really good breakfast at 8, and much of the training, because I was a 10-stone weakling, so I thought much of the training was running along railway tracks, which is good for boxing training because you have to keep breaking your step. You can neither do a sort of 2 steps on the railway lines, nor can you leap from one to the other. So you have to keep breaking. So it was good. Anyway, so there was I building myself up with all this extra food, and I was getting a few more muscles and exercise. So it was really very good, I thought. And I started off as a welterweight, I think. And this meant that I was very tall. I could stand, as it were, end on against my opponent and hold my hand out. And it was very hard for them ever to hit me, really. But unfortunately, due to all of these exercises, I got into the middleweight. And then there were these people who were sort of well-muscled and strong, and they started hitting me too hard. And so I gave up boxing in a very cowardly way. So my period as a boxer shows the opposite of me being a sort of true sportsman.
Thanks for setting the record straight for us. Biggest respect to you. Thank you so much for your time. Again, it's been fascinating to hear all of your stories and experiences. Many thanks.